recognize the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm so happy you're here. On this podcast, I hope to bring you insightful conversations with a variety of guests from all walks of life, people with stories, wisdom, and perspectives that inspire and inform. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, and if you feel inspired, leave a 5-star rating. It helps us reach more listeners like you. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Well, welcome to today's episode of Sagely Speaking. I am very excited to get into this conversation, this discussion, because it's truly something I've never really given a lot of direct thought about. And I want to welcome to Sagely Speaking Dr. Alison Athey, who is she's a behavioral scientist and works at RAND and other places. And I'm going to let you get into your career and to your research. But I found this really, really interesting. So what you want to talk about is the uniqueness of overdose deaths and the collateral damage in people, families, and communities, and how we're treating that, responding to it, and addressing it. So Alison, welcome. If I may call you Alison, doctor.
Yes, please. Thank you so much for having me, Mary. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this topic because you're not alone. There are so many people who are directly touched by overdose loss, overdose bereavement, but it's not something that's really commonly talked about in the policy world, in our regular lives, and even in my world as a researcher and a clinical psychologist. It's an area that's been really overlooked, especially when it comes to thinking about the broader overdose crisis and how this might fit in.
With the obvious question to start, why is it different than bereavement? I've lost a loved one and went through that and have experienced all that is. But why is it different from the death of a loved one from any other, whether it's a car crash or a disease? How is it different?
So one key way that overdose bereavement is different is that overdose in our country is still really highly stigmatized, as are substance use disorders. So typically when we lose someone, which we all will do at some point in our lives, we experience an outpouring of social support of our friends, families, and communities, recognizing the devastating impact of every loss that we could experience. When it comes to stigmatized deaths like overdose or suicide deaths are another example, that stigma really interferes with natural grieving processes so that the support that we might expect may not be given or offered to us, so that folks who are grieving an overdose death may experience stigmatization themselves, where people tell them really horrible things about what it means about them to have a family member or a loved one die by overdose, or what it means about that person. I've heard horrible things of folks being told that it was inevitable, or that it was a person's choice to die by overdose. So those types of stigma really interfere. But another thing that can happen is that people who have lost someone to overdose maybe push away or don't reach out to those natural supports because of fear of the stigmatization, the real fear that can occur. So there's a lot of isolation. That's a social element that really can moderate what happens when people are experiencing this kind of loss. There are psychological elements as well that we can think about, but I think that's a critical one that's really obvious. Unfortunately, there's not really a lot of research in this area, as I mentioned. So these are all theorized ways that overdose loss is different from other types of loss.
What about suicide loss? It seems that can be as damaging. And then, of course, the question is not only was it inevitable, but the other question is, it was your fault, or what could you have done to prevent it, I would assume. So how about the correlation, the differences between suicide, bereavement versus overdose, and then how it's handled as far as the survivor's guilt?
Absolutely. So in a lot of ways, overdose loss looks like suicide loss because of that stigma, because of the guilt that you mentioned, and because of the oftentimes surprise that comes along with both an overdose and a suicide loss on one hand, or on the other hand, the really long journey of mental health or substance use struggle in the other person that is really taxing and can really fracture the relationship. So these are complicated relationships with the loss, complicated relationships with the person. And what we found is that there's there's an increased suffering and there's not that natural healing that can come along. Sometimes people who lose a loved one by overdose experience some aspects that are different from suicide loss. So what we know in suicide loss is that people left behind often think of ending their own lives to be with their loved one in the afterlife or because of the pain of the loss. We see that also in people who've lost loved ones to overdose. But sometimes those folks don't think about ending their lives on purpose, but engage in escalating and risky substance use themselves to try to cope with the loss. And that can increase, we theorize, their own risk for overdose if they're coping in a way that's really unhelpful and different from how one might cope with suicide loss.
You know, you talk a lot about peer support, and I have found in my life that it's essential to find people, and it might be difficult. I think it's becoming easier, and certainly the internet can help, probably hurt too. But to find people who truly understand what you're going through, whether it's, again, coping with somebody who has a mental illness or suicidal ideation or whatever it might be. But I have found that people who are in the same boat, pretty much, are the greatest source of comfort for me and wisdom. Alison, I've met so many people over my career who have lost a child to an accidental overdose. And certainly fentanyl has only exacerbated that and made it so much worse, as we all know. But I admire these parents who are able to be resilient and go on, because I think I would be crumpled up on the floor, unable to get up. And that is a fear I have. And so how, again, I've worked with these parents and they find peer support. They come together, help each other. They also create nonprofits to try to address the epidemic. But, how important is peer support, and are we doing enough to build strong peer support networks?
Well, I agree. Peer support is profoundly impactful for people. As a clinical psychologist, I see this all the time when I lead support groups, where something that I might say as a professional may land differently than someone who has lived the experience saying the same thing. Of course, people who've lived the experience also bring more wisdom than those who've never experienced that type of loss can. So I think peer support is really, really promising for that reason of its impact. But I also think peer support is really promising as a way to address this grief crisis that we're experiencing because it's scalable. So what we know is that there's a shortage of mental health providers in the country. And so peer support works around or within that shortage by teaching people who've gone through something really traumatic how they can turn that trauma into a way to help other people. I work with a lot of organizations who are offering peer support for overdose grief right now. Folks like those at Peer Support Community Partners, a nonprofit organization based in New Hampshire, Overdose Lifeline, many, many others. And they have developed these really sophisticated models of deploying the peer support and of recruiting people who've experienced traumatic losses, who want to give of themselves and to continue to grieve in a different way by supporting others. Currently, I'm leading a study that is in partnership with these other organizations so that we can scientifically evaluate how peer support works and whether it changes outcomes in people who are left behind. But I do see it as really pivotal in this crisis, knowing that millions and millions of Americans have lost people to overdose.
Well, I know you are a behavioral scientist, so you collect data and study data. I am an anecdotal person, and so if I can be one data point for you, peer support works. If you had a message, though, to society on how to be helpful, and like the stigma exists, and those of us in the community and the advocates and policy people in the realm of substance use disorders and prevention, the stigma, try as we might, again, to smash the stigma, let's wait till the siren goes by.
I apologize. I live right next to a hospital, so we get folks in and out.
No worries. Okay, I think probably good enough. Okay, so let's go back. So the stigma, try as we might to smash the stigma, to give people the support they need, especially when they're trying to seek treatment. We talk about that recognizing this as a disease, and again, trying to help people get into treatment. How important is it? I mean, what is the missing ingredient on stigma? And do you think we're making progress as a whole on the stigma of substance use disorders?
I don't think there is any silver bullet when it comes to stigma. It's so pervasive, and it's something that captures the minds of all kinds of people, even people with lived experience of having a substance use disorder or losing someone to one, carry that internalized stigma. Personally, this is anecdotal, of course, but I see the silver lining of the COVID-19 pandemic as an increase in awareness and as an anti-stigma effect. I think during that pandemic, we realized, all of us on a personal level, how fragile our mental health and well-being is, and how many factors that are totally outside of our control can affect mental health and substance use. So I think that collective experience was really useful. In terms of targeted efforts, my sense is that we need to start early, that children, many of whom experience loss to overdose, many of whom have caregivers who have mental health or substance use problems, their attitudes are the most malleable. This is why we love children. They see the world through such innocent eyes. And if we can build off that natural instinct to hold compassion and understanding for others, I think we could go even further in terms of changing stigma. So that might look like school-based programs that teach people about mental health and substance use problems, what they can do about them, and how to interact with other people who are living with these kinds of problems. It's not an easy task, but if we start early and reach out broadly to our youth, I think we stand a chance to really turn the dial back on stigma.
It's interesting because I personally struggle with this a little bit. I think we want to stigmatize to some degree. We want to tell kids, don't use drugs, don't start, don't try it. This is dangerous. We don't want to have this mentality of, and unfortunately, I think we're getting there, especially with the legalization of marijuana. But I think, we don't want the message of, oh, go ahead and try it, you'll be fine. And I think that there's a lesson here and a fine point on where do we say, don't do it, as opposed to, let me help you get treatment.
Totally.
And I don't know how we braid those two together and ride that teeter-totter, but I think that's important. And really make the distinction on, we don't want to tell our kids, hey, it's okay to use.
It is so complicated for that reason that we want to have fine-tuned and well-crafted messages that don't encourage substance use, while also saying that people who use substances, people who develop addictions, that they remain people, they are suffering from a disease. My mind goes right to science. So how can we test different messages to see which ones are most effective? My background in terms of treatment and my background primarily in research has to do with suicide prevention. And it's the same thing there. We want to destigmatize suicide, but not glamorize it and not suggest that it's an acceptable way to cope, even though it's a way some people choose or some people experience. And what we know from suicide research is that there are messages that we can develop and that we can craft that sort of walk that line. I think this has been neglected in substance use, especially when we think about working with children or people who are already using substances, these messaging approaches that don't glamorize or lead folks to increase their substance use, especially children, but also that promotes recovery. One thing that's worked really well in suicide response is by really promoting the stories of people who have experienced a suicidal crisis and who have survived it and recovered. And I think that the same could be done when it comes to substance use, really lifting up the stories of people who struggled with substances and then overcame that struggle and are living happier, healthier lives.
Again, and that has changed. It's still not completely where it needs to be, because there are a lot of very successful people who are proud about their recovery and are very open to discuss it and talk about it publicly, which is so helpful. And of course, you go back to First Lady Betty Ford, who's one of the early pioneers who, was not afraid to be stigmatized or whatever, come what may, when she disclosed her alcohol use disorder. If you talk about the collateral damage, exactly how big is it? And I believe you said in one of your papers that it's disrupted the lives of 40 million adults. And what does that disruption look like? Is this, you can't work, you can't sleep, you can't eat? What does that look like? What does it mean?
Great question. We ran a study, a pretty small study, and we found that more than 40% of U.S. adults personally knew somebody who died by an overdose. And then a large proportion of them reported that there was this type of disruption. Here is where we have a research gap. We know some things about what that disruption looks like, but there really needs to be more research focusing on this collateral damage. So some things that we know can grow out of this type of traumatic loss, losing someone to an overdose, are things like post-traumatic stress disorder, mood disorders like depression, complicated and prolonged grief, which is separate from the grief that anyone would be expected to have after losing someone to an overdose, in its severity and its duration. It tends to last years and years. So those are some mental health disorders that we see in people who've lost someone to a traumatic loss like overdose. When we think about perhaps the biggest risk is those folks who lost someone to overdose, then using substances to cope with that grief, especially if they were already a risky user of substances. There's some preliminary research that suggests that those folks who have lost someone experience survivor's guilt or accept that they may be lost themselves to overdose. And so they escalate their substance use rather than losing someone and experiencing that as a rock bottom that results in them going into treatment. So my worry is that what's happening is more and more adults are losing people. We know that about 1.4 million U.S. children have lost a loved one, a family member. So children early on in their development are losing people to addiction and then eventually to overdose deaths. And that might be fueling this crisis at a population level where that individual loss feeds into increased risky substance use in people who may never have engaged in substance use that was risky, or people who were already really vulnerable because they were using illicit substances. That's my concern. And there is some data to suggest that that could be happening. There's a European study, it was a population-wide study that looked at what happened to parents who lost children to overdose. And their rate of external injury deaths was significantly higher than people who hadn't experienced that loss. Because of some statistical problems, they weren't able to say that whether that external injury death was suicide or whether it was a result of an accidental overdose. But we see that this collateral damage can be really deadly and threatens public health at a huge level.
What feedback are you getting from your research? Is it being well received and people are going, oh, great, let's throw money at this. We're going to solve it quickly?
That's a great question.
Tongue in cheek, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had a couple of responses. One is a really human response, I think, of connecting these dots of loss and risk in those left behind, and seeing intuitively that this problem threatens our public health. This problem is self-perpetuating, and that we need to address it through public health interventions at the population level, things like building peer support mechanisms, and funding better research so we know what's helpful for people who are grieving an overdose. The other response comes from a place of of scientific rigor. We have really, really rigorous research underway about how to prevent overdose deaths. Unfortunately, we don't have that same rigorous research when it comes to overdose loss, the science of overdose loss. So there's been some sort of circular concerns of, well, we don't have research to justify additional research, and we can't create the research we need because we don't have funding to do so until we do this preliminary research. So it's been a little bit of a dichotomy, but I'm really hopeful because those people who do have lived experience are the ones leading the way when it comes both to research and practice. And so I think we're being guided by people who have the wisdom necessary and the anecdotes to really understand where research could be invested, what policies could be made to have good effect, to give us the best odds in the absence of a full body of scientific research.
We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off.
As the mom of two amazing kids, I know how important it is to keep our children safe. And that's why I talk to them about the dangers of drugs. It is not always an easy conversation, but it's essential. By talking openly, we can help our kids understand the risks, which will help them make smart choices. Create a safe place for our kids to ask questions and share their feelings. Together, we can empower them to just say no. Start the conversation today. Your kids' future depends on it. The greatest gift is a conversation.
And now, back to our interview. I think what you're doing is remarkable. It's one thing, policy people, you're a scientist. I wasn't. I was just a policy maker, lawmaker, whatever. But we tended to look back. We were very frustrated. When I was in Congress, we're angry at the institutions for failing us as far as the prescription drug epidemic. And we don't need to get in that, but there are so many policy failures and leadership failures along the way. So we can do the postmortem looking back and what went wrong. But I do like that you're have an eye to the future here on the positive policies that can make an impact. And I think that is essentially important too. Now, is this all work that would be done at NIDA, National Institutes of Drug Abuse, or where would this work be coming from to lead this effort?
So my study that looked at the scope of the problem, the epidemiology of the problem, was a really teeny tiny, internally funded work of research at RAND. And it, I think, addressed some of those concerns about funding research without a scientific body to defend it. So my current study, where we're evaluating peer support for overdose grief, is funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. There are other folks who I think are in this game as well. I know that at the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, or PCORI, that there's some work underway looking at clinical interventions for people who are bereaved by overdose. But just like the overdose crisis is everyone's business, I think overdose grief is everyone's business, and there's room for people to contribute, whether it's policymakers or those who are managing settlement funds from prescription drug lawsuits. And to people who are just, in living their everyday lives, who likely know someone who is grieving an overdose loss and who have an opportunity to personally fight that stigma by supporting them in the way that they would if they lost someone to any other cause.
I think to me, that's the easiest part. It's easier said than done, but to me, that seems doable. I think people who are listening to this podcast hopefully can talk about this with their friends and families on how they might address this and how they might offer support.
A while ago, I'm very involved with a nonprofit called Mothers for Awareness and Prevention of Drug Abuse, MAPDA. And a few years ago, we did an ad campaign. It was Reverse the Silence. And the commercial that we did in partnership with Emergent Biosolutions and a handful of other nonprofits, the commercial was showing a mother who lost a child, and this was the wake at her house. And the whispers in the house of, do you know what really happened? And, oh, they say he was taking drugs, and all the stigmatized language. It was a very powerful commercial. I think it's on the MAPDA website. But you reminded me of that campaign. I'd completely forgotten about it. But I think people recognizing, hold somebody near and dear and realize that no death is without great pain for survivors, for loved ones. But this one these are especially complicated because of, as you've said, whether the torment going up to that moment or whatever reason. So I would encourage listeners to think about it, talk about it. But how did you get into this particular line of work? Were you personally affected?
That's a really great question. And in short, I haven't lost someone specifically to overdose, but I work with a lot of people who have. My training and my early career has really focused on suicide and suicide loss. And through that work, I was speaking with people who had lost loved ones to a variety of different types of suicide, including overdose. And then I started training in drug treatment centers. And I realized that the supports that suicide loss survivors had built for themselves and cultivated may be helpful to those who lost someone to an overdose, but that there isn't really a lot of infrastructure in place to study this, to connect people with resources really quickly, or to understand really what they need most during their grief. So really it was anecdotal. I was talking to a lot of people who had turned their grief into wisdom and shared that with me.
How can people find out more information about your work?
So I am listed on the RAND website. So that's a great place to find me. Folks are also welcome to find me at Johns Hopkins. I do my clinical work there, so I am on their website. And other folks are welcome to reach out to me by email. My email is listed on the RAND site if they would like to know more, or if they are interested in copies of relevant studies. I'm happy to provide those.
I think there'd be a lot of people want to help you who've experienced the lived experience of exactly what you're talking about. And I hope they do reach out, because there's a huge network of people who are looking for something to do and ways to help others who are going through the same thing. So I encourage people who would be listening, who are parents of a, accidental overdose victim, poisoning, to reach out and band together. And I think that a rising tide lifts all boats. And the more we can do together and collaborate, the better off we're going to be, certainly at chances of success. Is there anything that I haven't covered that you want to discuss?
The last thing you said really made me think about something that I bring up a lot when I'm working with loss survivors, and that's something called post-traumatic growth. Of course, we would all hope that no one experiences a special type of loss, that no one experiences trauma. But those who do, in the depths of their despair, I hope that they remember that as their grief develops and as time passes, that they might find themselves understanding other people, understanding themselves, and having insights to offer that they wouldn't have if they didn't have that lived experience. Sometimes that means folks become peer support providers to others, but sometimes that means that folks find ways to ensure that they are living their life in a way that is worth living, that they're living their life in a way that remembers and honors their loved one, but that there is this opportunity for growth, even though during those periods of intense grief, it's hard to see that.
I know in this paper you talk too about those who do use drugs are more likely to lose somebody. That's sort of an obvious point that you've made. Forgive me.
No.
But it's very obvious that, if you're using drugs to be around more people who probably are and then might experience a loss, how likely are these people to seek treatment, to seek help, because I do know folks who in this exact boat, and they bury their grief. I think, and I've known people who've lost 5 or 6 loved ones, friends, and they bury that grief and they move on. How big a problem is that?
The honest answer is we really don't know the extent to which an overdose loss increases a risk in those left behind. There's really no research specifically on that, unfortunately. But it is obvious when we sit and think about it, and when we speak to people who've been through treatment or people who are practitioners in substance use treatment facilities. We see that every day, that people who use drugs are so vulnerable to losing someone who maybe they use drugs with, or maybe they're a family member who shared that biological vulnerability to addiction. There's some interesting research out of RAND that doesn't help us to understand the size of that problem or how many people seek help, but it does show that there seems to be 2 types of responses. Some people who experience that loss recognize that this is a turning point in their life and that they have a chance to go get help, and it increases their motivation to get help, which is so important because recovery is very, very hard. Other people, as you mentioned, they bury the grief. They use substances or other maladaptive ways of coping to escape from that emotional pain, survivor's guilt, all those things that come along with grief. So we don't know how many fall into the 2 different groups, but we know that these 2 different groups exist, and that can help us in the future to develop peer support interventions or clinical interventions so that when somebody dies, those who are left behind get support right away. And if that support involves substance use support, it may have the potential to save lives.
Well, I'm going to try to end on a positive note. My listeners so often tell me, Mary, end on a positive note. Give us an uplifting ending. Let us leave this podcast feeling good and hopeful and happy. And sometimes that's very difficult, especially when you talk about this world that we're talking about today. But can you give us the last few minutes of hope and how things can be better tomorrow than they were today?
Fortunately I can, and I can use numbers this time. We found, the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Centers for Disease Control have found that in the last year for which we have data, that there was a decrease in the number of overdose deaths that happened by thousands and thousands of people. It was the first time that we saw that decrease. And so we know that not only were lives saved, but also many people were able to stay with their loved one and not experience the type of grief that we're seeing. So as we think across the population, we are at a tipping point, and my hope is that as stigma decreases, as resources increase, as policies change, that we'll see fewer and fewer people who are struggling with substance use that could be life-threatening, or who are struggling with losing someone to an overdose.
Well, only fitting a data scientist would end on data and using data as an uptick. But it's important with that data. And a lot of people are still saying, obviously, it's way too high. And we know that. But you do reinforce what you're doing right. Whatever we're doing that is working, find it and do more of it. What we're doing that is not working, get rid of it, discard it. So it's really important that we take this opportunity with a blip of success and double down, triple down, quadruple down, and do more of what's working. So I just want to thank you so much. And I want to thank our mutual friend, Bo Kilmer, for introducing us, making this connection, and saying that I would love to talk to you and hear about what you're doing. So thank you, Bo. And again, we're going to follow you. Please let us know how it goes and how we can be helpful. If you need to, do some stuff on the Hill and bring this to people and you need help, let us know. And so again, thank you very, very much for joining us today on Sagely Speaking, and we admire your work and wish you great success with it. So sorry, Alison, go ahead, especially if it's a compliment. I hate cutting people off at the end.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for highlighting this issue. It's been on the back burner for far too long, and I'm excited to think about ways that can change. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. You're a pioneer. So thank you to our listeners. We really appreciate you being here and stopping by. We do hope you find words of wisdom in today's episode with Alison and step in to help. And to our sponsors, thank you so much. We couldn't do this without you, and we really appreciate everything you do to keep this show up and running. And until next time, we'll see you on another episode of Sagely Speaking, and be well.